Welcome to Orion Philosophy, where we explore, discuss and dissect areas of practical philosophy for use in everyday life. To bear trials with a calm mind robs misfortune of its strength and burden. The world around us is full of things that threaten our peace of mind. Whether it's someone cutting us off in traffic, our boss asking us to work late again, an argument with our partner, crash in the stocks or crypto markets, or comparing your life to the meticulously selected and edited photos you see scrolling through social media. Generally, there are two ways we process these kind of things. For this explanation, I'll call them default and deliberate. Default is the state where we're essentially on autopilot. We react impulsively, and because we're on autopilot and there's no filter between the stimulus and the response, we essentially allow these impulses to dictate our mental state. If we get cut off in traffic, we get angry. If we're asked to work late, we get resentful. If we argue with our partner, we get defensive. And every day, every week, and every year of our life, our well-being is in the hands of the events around us. Our mental state becomes tightly bound to these externals, and as a result, it becomes fragile. Our mood comes and goes like the tide, and we wonder why we can't find lasting happiness. On the other hand, deliberate is the state in which we take responsibility for how we perceive what happens around us, how we respond to it, and how much we allow externals to influence our well-being. Instead of reacting impulsively, we put a mental gate between stimulus and our response. This gate allows us to quarantine stimulus for a while, allows us to question it and look at it from different angles, and then ultimately allow us to decide deliberately how we react. The more we exercise this, the stronger the gate becomes, and the faster we are able to process stimulus. Our well-being is no longer in the hands of externals, it is ours to decide. Our mental state becomes resilient to what happens around us, and we are better able to find lasting happiness and well-being. This is the value that the Stoics have left with us, a practical life philosophy that gives us the tools to hold stimulus in a sort of mental quarantine before they can infect the rest of our mind with whatever negativity may come from perceiving them in a destructive way, especially when we get into the habit of responding to negative things by default. More than 2,000 years ago, the ancient Stoics gathered in Athens to discuss how to live a good life, a life of flourishing, well-being and mental resilience. They considered the question how to live with virtue, the four core Stoic virtues being wisdom, discipline, temperance, and courage. And we'll go into a bit more detail about what these four mean later on. Stoicism is a school of ancient Hellenistic philosophy founded around 300 BC by a man named Zeno of Citium. Before choosing the path of the philosopher, Zeno was a wealthy merchant, and he made good money sailing from port to port around Cyprus and Greece. Zeno was described as a thin, dark-skinned man, and despite his wealth, he was said to have lived a frugal and simple life. And to his misfortune, he found himself washing up on the shores of Greece, after losing his ship to sea. Without his livelihood, Zeno made his way to Athens. Here he is said to have read the accounts of Socrates in an Athenian bookseller's. So impressed was Zeno with what he read, that he asked the bookseller where he can find men such as Socrates, to which the bookseller pointed out Crates of Thebes, a prominent Cynic philosopher at the time in Athens. So then Zeno began to study Cynic philosophy under Crates, and expanded his learning with a handful of other teachers and schools of thought like Platonism. In 301 BC, Zeno began to teach his own philosophy in the colonnade of the Agora of Athens known as the Stoa Poikile, or painted porch. It is this Stoa which gave his students the name of Stoics. Anyone was welcome to come and listen and debate ideas. Zeno's philosophy concerned itself with finding ways to live the best possible life, one which through living in accordance with nature led to happiness, well-being, virtue, and free from needless suffering. I will note that being free from needless suffering is not the same as being free from all suffering. It's simply not suffering any more than is necessary. So what did the Stoics believe? And how did they go about finding happiness and well-being, or what they called eudaimonia? Stoic philosophy is one of practicality, a toolbox that we can all use for everyday life, and focuses on one question: how can we find a path to happiness? In ancient Greece and Rome, Stoicism was the philosophy for the everyday men and women of the world, not just for educated aristocrats, or isolated philosophers in their halls of books, or silent sages up their mountains. It was practiced anywhere from emperors to soldiers, and was applicable to both. For the Stoics, the practical path to eudaimonia is grounded in a few core principles: the ability to view ourselves, the world, and its people objectively, and accept their nature as it is, rather than projecting our own opinions onto them about how we think they should be. Generally, the greater the distance between what we think something should be and what it is in reality, the greater the amount we suffer. The discipline to prevent ourselves from being controlled by the desires for pleasure or the fear of pain and suffering. The ability to behave with Stoic virtue, wisdom, temperance, justice, and courage. And making the distinction between what is within our power to influence and what is not. Using this information, we can act what can be acted upon, and we can dismiss what can't. Stoic philosophy grew to be one of the most prominent schools of thought in ancient Greece and Rome. And it became so popular because it works. This was a time in history where war, famine, exile, death, and disease was far more common than it is today in our modern world. The potential for suffering was everywhere, and these are exactly the conditions in which Stoic philosophy thrives. And while we don't live in the same world as our ancestors, we do have our own problems to contend with, and the philosophy of the Stoics is just as applicable today. Stoic philosophy teaches us that we are not disturbed by events, only how we respond to them. They also teach that very little is inside our control, simply our thoughts, beliefs, perceptions, and actions. These two ideas are important for a number of reasons. Firstly, it instructs us to take responsibility for how we view things, understanding that our perceptions of things is a core source of suffering. Rather than just blaming the world or other people for our situation or our mood, we are empowered to accept that it is us who create our own happiness. Secondly, it draws a line between what we do and do not have control over. Many people suffer because we get upset about or try to control the things in life that we have no control over. And of course, this ultimately leads us to feel helpless, ineffective, powerless, bitter, resentful, and therefore we suffer. However, when we focus on what we can control, we start to become effective and efficient. We problem solve more easily, and we suffer less. The key to this is to accept that there is very little within our control, and focus our efforts on the small patch of land that we own. A farmer will have a better harvest if they focus on planting, tending to, and harvesting their own crops, rather than focusing on their neighbor's field, which they have no control over. But instead of crops, we have our thoughts, our actions, our perspectives, and our beliefs. The ancient Stoics used 4 core Stoic virtues as a guide for their actions, and in a compass to point them in the right direction during times of hardship, times of confusion, and the day-to-day decisions of everyday life. Many even went so far as to suggest that virtue is the path to happiness, and that ethics is the primary concern for human understanding, and that through ethics, the ability to tell right from wrong, and living in line with the nature of the world around you, we naturally become happier and are better able to work to the betterment of the self and the community. The Stoics believed that people who lack virtue are blindly pulled along by whatever pulls at their desire. The philosopher Cleanthes once said that these people are like a dog tied to a cart, compelled to go wherever the cart goes. Rather than being pulled behind the cart of desire, the Stoics would look at a situation and decide how to respond. They learnt to untie themselves from being pulled along, and in doing so, they learnt the ability to be happy in hardship, content in adversity, and accepting in loss. In part, it is the development of virtue that helps cut these strings that drag our emotions and well-being through the dirt whenever we experience pain, loss, and hardship. These Stoic virtues are wisdom, seeing things for what they are, not what we wish they would be. In his lectures, Epictetus said, "The chief task in life is simply this, to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals not under my control, and which have to do with the choices I actually control. Where then do I look for good and evil? Not to uncontrollable externals, but within myself, to the choices that are my own." Courage, acting in the right way despite fear or reservation. The Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote, "There are misfortunes which strike the sage, without incapacitating him, of course, such as physical pain, infirmity, the loss of friends or children, or the catastrophes of his country when it is devastated by war. I grant that he is sensitive to these things, for we do not impute to him the hardness of a rock or of iron. There is no virtue in putting up with the fact that one does not feel it. Justice. Acting fairly despite the pressures not to. The Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote, "And a commitment to justice in your own acts," which means thoughts and actions resulting in the common good, what you were born to do. Temperance. Acting in discipline and self-control, despite the draws of passion and greed. Marcus Aurelius also wrote, "If you seek tranquility, do less." Or more accurately, do what's essential, what the logos of a social being requires, and in the requisite way, which brings a double satisfaction to do less better. Because most of what we say and do is not essential. If you can eliminate it, you'll have more time and more tranquility. Ask yourself at every moment, is this necessary? While the Stoics use these virtues to direct their actions and behavior, they are useless if we can't develop the headspace to use them. If we're too consumed by our unconscious feelings in the moment to become conscious and decide how to respond. Simply put, if we remain like the dog being pulled by the cart, we will always go where the cart goes, and never go where we would like to go. The author of Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl, wrote about stimulus and response, and he said that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our growth and our freedom. We need to learn how to create this space, and when we find ourselves in it, we are able to decide how to react to a situation, rather than letting our unconscious react for us, regardless of whether we want to live in alignment with the Stoic virtues, or reflect different virtues that we've chosen for ourselves. If our aim is to live deliberately and unhitch ourselves from impulsive behavior and snap judgments, learning to find this space is essential. There is a concept in Stoic philosophy that can transform our frustrations into acceptance, our anger into understanding, and can help us focus our limited time each day on the things that create real impact and change in our life, rather than mistakenly and unknowingly focusing on the things that waste it. This is the Stoic concept of control. Simply put, we can't always control what happens to us, but we can always decide how we react to it. Our response is our responsibility, and it's a choice. Today we're going to explore the ancient Stoic philosophy behind this concept and look at how we can implement it in our daily life. The philosopher Epictetus was born into slavery in ancient Greece. He was permitted by his master to study Stoic philosophy under the guidance of philosopher Musonius Rufus. Epictetus earned his freedom around the age of 18, shortly after the death of Emperor Nero. With this newfound freedom, he took to Rome to teach his philosophy for a further 25 years. Until Emperor Domitian banned philosophers from the city because of the threat their free thinking had on the control of his rule. This meant that Epictetus ended up leaving Rome and settling in the newly formed city of Nicopolis in ancient Greece. Here he lived a simple life and founded a school of philosophy where he taught until he passed away from old age. Sadly, Epictetus didn't write any of his work down. However, we are left with the work of one of his students who transcribed the lectures of Epictetus close to word for word. Of 8 books written, only 4 survive. But for me, these 4 contain some of the best practical philosophy from the ancient world. Within this is one of the core teachings of Epictetus' Stoic philosophy, the concept of control. He taught that a path to a happy life, a life of what the Stoics called eudaimonia, can be found in 2 things. The first is correctly identifying what is within our control and identifying what is not. The second is focusing our efforts on the things within our control and learning to accept what is not with grace and understanding. This distinction is an important one because no matter how much we try, no matter how upset we get or frustrated we become, we cannot change the things outside the reach of our control. A life of attempting to do so will undoubtedly result in bitterness, frustration, and wasted effort. On the other hand, a life focused on doing what we can with what we have and focusing on what's within our power is much more likely to be productive, effective, and altogether more constructive. Epictetus said, "The chief task in life is simply this, to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself, Which are externals not under my control, and which have to do with the choices I actually control? Where then do I look for good and evil? Not to uncontrollable externals, but within myself, to the choices that are my own. This particular concept in Stoicism is widely known as the dichotomy of control. So called because things are really only divided into what we can control and what we can't. Epictetus took this further and helped describe exactly what's within our power and what's not. He also helped us understand the pitfalls of spending too much time focusing on changing what we have no power to change, and the benefits of focusing on the areas of life within our power to change. In his writing, his student recounts the following. There are things that are within our power, and things that fall outside our power. Within our power are our own opinions, aims, desires, dislikes. In a sum, our own thoughts and actions. Outside our power are our physical characteristics, the class into which we were born, our reputation in the eyes of others, and honors and offices that may be bestowed on us. Working within our sphere of control, we are naturally free, independent and strong. Beyond that sphere, we are weak, limited and dependent. If you pin your hopes on things outside your control, taking upon yourself things which rightfully belong to others, you are liable to stumble, fall, suffer, and blame both gods and men. But if you focus your attention only on what is truly your own concern, and leave to others what concerns them, then you will be in charge of your interior life. No one will be able to harm or hinder you. You will blame no one, and have no enemies. If you wish to have peace and contentment, release your attachment to all things outside your control. This is the path of freedom and happiness. If you want not just peace and contentment, but power and wealth too, you may forfeit the former in seeking the latter, and will lose your freedom and happiness along the way. The Stoic Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius also wrote about similar concepts in his journal. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." So how can we harness this Stoic practice and turn it into a daily habit to increase our happiness and resilience? For me, a good and important first step is training our mind to quickly sort the things around us and within us into one of two categories. Essentially inside our control or outside our control. And then something a lot easier said than done, we have to learn to accept the things that are outside our control as they are, and at the same time take full responsibility for everything inside our control. These two things are important because when we get it wrong, we suffer. And we normally suffer in one of two ways. The first way we suffer is trying to control things in life we have no influence over. This can be other people, their beliefs, their thoughts, actions and values, the weather, the traffic, the economy, politics, time and many, many other things. Obviously, when we try and control the uncontrollable, we're putting effort into an endeavor in which we have no leverage. This results in us having little or no impact. And this result ends up with us feeling powerless, frustrated, anxious, ineffective, bitter and angry. In a nutshell, we suffer. No one likes to put effort into something and get nothing in return. Or worse yet, put effort into something and get the complete opposite we want in return. And because we have no control over these situations, if we attach our happiness to them, we're essentially putting our happiness into the hands of chance and the hands of the whim of the world around us. So it's easy to see why this is not a resilient form of happiness. If everything is going well around us, we'll be happy. If everything is going poorly, we'll be sad. Our happiness will come and go based on external events and how they transpire, which is a very fragile way of living. The second way we suffer is we don't take responsibility for what we can control. These are our beliefs, our values, our perspectives, and our actions. When we don't take responsibility for these things and instead blame the world or other people for things like our actions, we're essentially saying that we don't have autonomy over what we do and who we are. This is a very helpless mindset to have, and it will wear you down over time. People stuck here often complain, moan, point fingers, whinge, and create a mentality of victimhood because the world is always acting upon them. And as they respond to the world acting upon them, they blame what happens in the world for their response. This is not a healthy place to be, because if we believe that we don't have any control over our actions, our perspectives, values, and beliefs, there's nothing we can do to get out of the situation we're in. We just have to wait until the world around us does something that creates an outcome in us that we're happy with. And again, it's probably easy to see why this way of living doesn't produce lasting and resilient happiness. because everything is still at the whim of the world around us. Our well-being is beholden to externals, rather than being our responsibility to cultivate. The Stoic dichotomy of control helps us shift our perspective of these things in two important ways. When we are able to determine what is outside our control, we no longer waste our time and energy trying to change it. We see it for what it is, we accept it, and we move on to what we can control. When we are able to determine what is within our control, we are able to focus our time and energy here, taking responsibility and taking actions in these areas to move forward. Epictetus also said, "Make the best use of what is in your power, and take the rest as it happens." And it's all well and good understanding these logically, but it takes practice, and it requires deliberate effort to start building those mental pathways. But if you stick with it, soon splitting these things into two different categories becomes second nature, and you'll naturally see these two pathways and use it to determine how to act in the face of events around you. And to leave you with some final thoughts, in his book A Guide to the Good Life, William Irvine explores this subject of control and describes the following. Remember that the things over which we have complete control are the goals we set for ourselves. I think that when a Stoic concerns himself with the things over which he has some but not complete control, such as winning a tennis match, he will be very careful about the goals he sets for himself. In particular, he will be careful to set internal rather than external goals. Thus, his goal in playing tennis will not be to win the match, something external over which he has only partial control, but to play to the best of his ability in the match, something internal over which he has complete control. By choosing this goal, he will spare himself the frustration or disappointment should he lose the match. Since it was not his goal to win the match, he will not have failed to attain his goal as long as he played his best. His tranquility will not be disrupted. Irvine also wrote, "Stoics would recommend, for example, that I concern myself with whether my wife loves me, even though this is something over which I have some but not complete control. But when I do concern myself with this, my goal should not be the external goal of making her love me. No matter how hard I try, I could fail to achieve this goal, and would as a result be quite upset. Instead, my goal should be an internal goal, to behave to the best of my ability in a lovable manner. Similarly, my goal with respect to my boss should be to do my job to the best of my ability. These goals I can achieve no matter how my wife and my boss subsequently react to my efforts." By internalizing his goals in daily life, the Stoic is able to preserve his tranquility while dealing with things over which he has only partial control. Death and our impermanence has a profound impact on the way we view the world, the way we view ourselves and the people around us. If we view death in a destructive way, it will hang over us, clouding everything we do. However, there is a way to view death that adds gratitude and vibrance to life, and this perspective employed by the Stoics is exactly what we're going to explore today. The fear of death is something we all encounter at different points in our life, whether it's dealing with the grief and feelings of loss of the death of a loved one, coming to terms with the fact that a loved one may soon pass, or simply the struggle we all have knowing that one day we will be gone. Today we're going to primarily be exploring Stoic philosophy to find out how not only we can reduce our fear of death, but also use the ever-present reality that one day we won't be here anymore as a tool to look at everything around us and use our mortality as a tool for gratitude. This practice is widely known as Memento Mori, roughly translating from Latin as remembering mortality. When you strip humans down to our bare bones, generally our basic instinctive wiring is to survive and replicate. And given that that is true, death is clearly a non-desirable. So much so that we don't even like thinking about it, we don't like contemplating it, and in extreme cases we don't even like accepting it as a reality. And while the denial of death can make us feel warm and fuzzy, it can also lock us out of the practical benefits that come from its contemplation. After all, we are all going to die. We're all temporary. Our time is limited, and our experience of this life will come to an end. Stoicism tells us that reminding ourselves of this reality can have a huge improvement on the way we live. The Stoics taught that in the constant reminder of death, we can learn how to live. Almost counterintuitively, thinking about death can help us live better, happier, and more present lives. So we've gone through a bit about what Memento Mori is. Now let's have a look at how exactly it can achieve what I've just described. The concept of Memento Mori has spanned both time and culture. We've already seen that the Stoics use Memento Mori, but it's also been used by people like the Buddhists, all in an effort to learn how to live better lives. And as we've said, it's the reminder that your death is inevitable, that your time is limited. And one day there will be a day where you and I won't wake up to enjoy the beautiful experience of life. With modern medicine as it is, death is a guarantee. No matter where you were born, how rich you are, or what you were doing during your life, there will be a day where you die. At least until someone comes up with a way not to. And on that day, we will be asking ourselves entirely new philosophical questions. Ultimately, death is simply change, and change is the nature of the universe. However, for those of us who know how to use it, the reality of death helps us cultivate a greater appreciation of life. If you can humor me for a moment and imagine that you only have 1 week left to live. Now imagine that in this last remaining week, you have a list of things you want to do, people that you want to spend time with, and places that you want to go. For most of us, we have a pretty short list of things that we do in a week, and it normally includes the people we love, the things we love doing, or the things we've always wanted to do but never have. Memento Mori uses this same principle, but instead of only having a week to live and think about death, we have our entire life. Memento Mori allows us to look honestly at our mortality, and in doing so, it helps us clarify what's important. It helps us find our values. It helps us be grateful for things because we know that these things are limited. And it helps us focus on problems that really matter, not the small insignificant bickering that ultimately wastes our time and doesn't add any value to our lives. Ancient Stoic philosophy is full of examples that instructed students to meditate on death and to contemplate their mortality. In his letters, Seneca speaks of the benefits from meditating on death. He wrote the following: "Let us prepare our minds as if we'd come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day. The one who puts the finishing touches on their life each day is never short of time." The Stoic philosopher Epictetus recommends that whenever you spend time with your loved ones, whenever you hug your family or kiss your partner, you should remind yourself that they are mortal. There will come a day where the people you love will no longer be there. This reminder is not intended to make us sad, and it's not intended to be morbid, but it does help us to appreciate what we have and really focus and be present when we're with these people, because we never really know how much time we have left with them. The Stoic philosopher and emperor of Rome, Marcus Aurelius, also practiced Memento Mori, contemplating his own mortality to guide his actions. In the book Meditations, he wrote, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." Stoic philosophers did not see death as a morbid idea to be avoided. It was a core aspect of life that needed to be accepted, even embraced, and ultimately used as a tool to appreciate each new day, remaining grateful for the time that we have and guiding our actions. After all, death is ultimately outside the reach of our control. It's true that we can eat well, we can exercise, we can sleep well, and do what we can to live a long and happy life, but ultimately our end will come. And like anything outside our control, worrying too much and focusing too much energy here ultimately does us no good. Shifting to another philosopher, in Plato's recount of the death of Socrates, arguably Athens' most famous philosopher, Socrates famously met death with a calm indifference, and his last words were said to be uttered to a close friend about paying a debt of chickens. Plato argues that the study of philosophy is about nothing else but dying. It is a path taken to find a way of living and a way of thinking about life that ultimately allows us to face death calmly and with grace. The concept of Memento Mori is not just found in Western philosophy, it also echoes in Eastern philosophy as well. I'm sure we've all heard of the samurai. As a kid, we probably all wanted to be one, or at least at some point pretended to be one. The samurai used death as a mental practice to enjoy life, to conquer fear, and ultimately become better warriors. The way of the samurai is, morning after morning, the practice of death, considering whether it will be here or there, imagining the most sightly way of dying, and putting one's mind firmly in death. Although this might be a most difficult thing, if one will do it, it can be done. There is nothing that one should suppose cannot be done. There is a comparison that can be made between human life and the Japanese cherry blossoms. In Japan, the cherry blossom has become part of the culture, and the pink-white blossoms can be followed through the country as the blossom moves with the change in temperature. A large part of what makes the blossom beautiful is that they only last for a short period of time. In a similar way, enjoyment of life becomes more profound because it's fleeting. The Buddhists of Tibet have a practice called the 4 thoughts that turn the mind. One of these thoughts is the contemplation of death and of our impermanence. It consists of the following: all things made from other things are impermanent. The human body is a thing made from other things. Therefore, the death of the body is certain. The time of death is uncertain and beyond our control. It's very easy to see a parallel here between Buddhism and Stoicism, but this Buddhist idea specifically was designed for daily contemplation. It was done to prevent the natural human tendency to behave as though we have all the time in the world. This central teaching of Buddhism is called Marasanati, or death awareness, and is thought to be a core part of living a better life. This is a tool that we can all use in day-to-day life. All of this helps us become aware of how short our time really is, and in doing so helps us question whether or not we are making the most of the time we have. And to close with some final thoughts, for me, Memento Mori is made up of a certain amount of order and chaos. Left to its own devices, our base human nature is pretty chaotic. Without us putting in some effort to stop it, our mind starts to tick over and over in unconscious loops, essentially putting us into autopilot. And with how busy our modern day is, it's easy for our mind to always have something to pick up and think about. Before we know it, we've woken up, we've had breakfast, we've gone to work, we've come home from work, we've stuck the TV on and we've gone to bed. And in that time, we're mostly on autopilot. We haven't really been present, and we take a lot of what's around us for granted. This unconscious chaos can be balanced with order when we take the time to consciously be aware of what's around us, consciously be aware of the moment, and consciously be grateful not only for the time we have, but for the people and experiences that fill that time, and also grateful for ourselves. We're often far too hard on ourselves, magnifying our mistakes and pushing aside our achievements. But balanced gratitude for me isn't just about being grateful for what's around us, it's also being grateful for who we are and what we've gone through. This order helps us appreciate what we have, and prevents that autopilot from ticking over and taking everything for granted. Modern life can be chaotic and frustrating at times. We've all had days where we felt overwhelmed with work, responsibilities, grief, pain, and any number of external events that threaten to destabilize our peace of mind. Here at Orion Philosophy, we bring out videos every week specifically to tackle the imbalance between sources of suffering in the world around us and the tools that we're given to deal with them. It's great to see the community growing around this goal, and if you think it's something that you'd like, feel free to sub and join us. To that end, today we're going through the Stoic principle of Amor Fati, and the practice of shifting our perception of the things around us, from resistance and suffering to acceptance, understanding, and ultimately love. Ancient Stoic philosophy contains a number of core practices that help the practitioner change the way they look at life, and in such a way that their burdens are lessened, their stress is eased, and in many cases they go through a transformation of things they once thought to be sources of pain and hardship, and shift them into sources of strength and understanding. We'll be covering exactly what Amor Fati means, and looking specifically at how you can use it in your day-to-day life to help balance, develop, and maintain your mental well-being. Socrates once said that we are the caretakers of our soul, and hopefully today you'll take away some tools to become exactly that. First of all, if Amor Fati is learning to love fate, what exactly do we mean when we say fate? To be honest, this can be interpreted in many different ways. For me personally, a practical definition of fate in this context is simply the unraveling of everything that has happened, everything that is happening, and everything that will happen. These happenings are determined by the nature of the world around us, they're determined by the laws of physics, and the events that have transpired previously, leading to subsequent events, like complex dominoes knocking into one another. This domino analogy might bring up questions about determinism or free will, and it's outside the scope of this video. However, if you personally have an opinion on free will or determinism, let me know in the comments down below because I think it's a fascinating topic. But coming back to fate, I don't think that fate in this context has anything to do with an overall universal consciousness or anything deliberately dictating what does and doesn't happen. So then what is Amor Fati? Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate brings you together, but do so with all your heart." Literally speaking, Amor Fati is a Latin phrase that translates roughly as love of fate, and it's been used for thousands of years to describe a state of mind or a practice in which you accept and even embrace everything that has happened, is happening, and has yet to happen. It's the mindset of understanding and accepting that the nature of the universe is change, that much of this change is outside the reach of our control, and that without this change we would not exist, our relationships wouldn't exist, we wouldn't laugh, cry, love, create, or grow. Without everything that has come before now, and without everything that is happening now, we wouldn't experience any of what life has to offer, both the good and the bad. And in this way, from this perspective, we can learn to love everything that has come before us and everything that's happening around us, and then by extension, learn to love fate. Marcus Aurelius also wrote, "Frightened of change, but what can exist without it? What's closer to nature's heart? Can you take a hot bath and leave the firewood as it was? Eat food without transforming it? Can any vital process take place without something being changed? Can't you see it's just the same with you, and just as vital to nature?" Hopefully this gives context about what Amor Fati actually means, and some insight into the practice itself. But it's one thing to understand something, and another thing to implement it. So how can we practically use Amor Fati in our day-to-day lives? Viktor Frankl was a Jewish psychotherapist who lived during World War II. And during the war he was sent to various concentration camps, including Auschwitz. Frankl ultimately survived the horrors of the war and went on to write a book called Man's Search for Meaning. It's not a very big book, but I highly recommend reading it. Almost every page has some value on how to develop a resilient personal philosophy, and to anyone who's interested, I'll include a link down below in the description. Frankl had a very simple personal philosophy, one that he credited for helping him survive the hardships and adversities of the concentration camps, until he was ultimately rescued by Allied forces in April 1945. His philosophy echoes the teachings of the Stoics. You can't always control the events that happen to you in your life, but you can always control how you respond to them. And this is how we use concepts of practical philosophy, not to exert any more control over the world around us, but to take full responsibility and ownership for how you view it, and how you respond to it, making a conscious decision to change your perceptions for the better. If we take responsibility for this, we no longer point fingers and blame the world or other people when we're upset or angry or frustrated or sad. We look inward to find out why we're acting like this, and then we make conscious decisions to change our perceptions for the better. Of course, I'm not saying that all negative emotion is bad, but what I am saying is those emotions are our responsibility, and not just those emotions, but how we act and respond to the world as a result of them. So if we take responsibility for our response to the world, and we take responsibility for making conscious decisions to change our perception of things for the better, with Amor Fati, this means changing how we perceive what's happened to us, or is happening to us. We can start by asking ourselves pointed questions. Have we suffered and struggled? Yes. Can we go back and avoid the struggle? No. So if we can't go back and change the past, the next best thing is accepting that it has happened and finding the good in it. Whether it's something in the hardship that taught us more about ourselves, or a lesson learnt that can help us or others avoid similar hardship in the future. Have we experienced loss? How did that teach us to appreciate what we have and not take things for granted? Did we lose our job? What doors did that open that may have remained closed? Did someone mistreat us? Did that person showing that side of them end a relationship that could have gone on for longer and been more destructive? This may seem overly optimistic, but when these events have already happened, really we get no benefit from walking around with negativity or resentment about them. Negativity won't change the past. However, optimism and a deliberate choice regarding how we look at the past can improve how we live right now in the present. One thing about Amor Fati that I do want to touch on quickly is that it often gets confused with a passive defeatist acceptance of the world around us. That this practice leads us to accept the wrongs of the world, and to lie down as we observe the passing of things that we don't agree with, or wrongdoing we see being committed. This is not the case. Acceptance of reality is not the same as submitting to it. It's simply learning the ability to see it objectively and accepting that in this moment, that is the state of the world. There's often little value in seeing the world as you want to see it, rather than seeing it as it is, other than getting a warm fuzzy feeling as you pull the wool over your own eyes. And this acceptance of reality is the ability to look at reality clearly and not through the lens of our own bias and expectations. In doing so, we are more able to understand what's within our control and what is not. And then if we deem it appropriate, we can look to leverage that control to effect change first in ourselves, and then if possible in the world around us for the better. Amor Fati is often credited to the Stoics. Epictetus, the slave who later became a philosopher, talked about similar concepts. And as we've already seen, the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote about fate in his journal, a journal that later became known as Meditations. Later philosophers like Nietzsche explicitly used the term Amor Fati in their writings. Nietzsche wrote, "My formula for greatness in a human being is Amor Fati. That one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. Not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it, but love it." My interpretation of this is that Nietzsche is saying that we should not hide from fate. We shouldn't conceal fate, nor should we wish it to be different. Ultimately, fate is what it will be, not what we wish it will be. So we should accept it. However, more than just acceptance, we should learn to love fate and embrace it. He went on to write further, "For nothing is self-sufficient, neither in us ourselves, nor in things. And if our soul has trembled with happiness, and sounded like a harp string just once, all eternity was needed to produce this one event. And in this single moment of affirmation, all eternity was called good, redeemed, justified, and affirmed." For me here, Nietzsche is saying that when we are happy, the entire world and all of history was necessary to lead up to that moment of happiness. Without that history, you would not be here, and you would not have felt that happiness. So if you resist, hate, or complain about fate, you are resisting the conditions that have given you life. Again, like a set of dominoes knocking over one another. The first domino is needed for the last to fall. In the same way, all of the conditions of the past were needed for you to be here right now.